Alright, hello everyone. Welcome to our next lesson here. So today we're going to take a look at the lives of free African Americans. So our objectives and standards are to analyze the success and struggles of free African Americans and to explain the role of free African Americans in westward expansion. And take a moment there to read the standards, please. And our desired result. What success and struggles did free African Americans face? So the antebellum period in free African Americans. Despite a strong slave system, free African Americans grew in population in the country. Now, they could save money to buy their freedom, while others were a lot of times freed by their owners. And some states still passed laws that made emancipation or freedom harder. Another way that African Americans could earn their freedom was through military service, such as in the War of 1812, also grant African Americans freedom. And there are also other examples of slaves being freed for different actions, such as the slaves who saved the state capital in Georgia from burning. Many free African Americans married and had children, which also increased the population of free African Americans. So there are examples of African American slave owners. Now, some African Americans did become wealthy, such as William Ellison, after his freedom, and they became slave owners themselves. By 1840, there were about 3,400 African Americans who owned slaves in the United States. Now, the majority of these African American slave owners were small business or factory owners. There were some who owned farms, but most of them, like I said, were small business or factory owners. African American slave owners also tried to purchase slave families together, to avoid separation of parents and their children, or husbands and wives, and things like that. Typically, free African Americans owned family members as slaves, since laws made granting freedom very difficult. So maybe a husband would buy his wife from slavery, maybe his parents, or their children, or nieces or nephews, or things like that. Now, there's a different society in Florida. The free African Americans in Florida were typically escaped slaves. Now, when Florida was a Spanish colony, slavery was forbidden there, but that's going to change when the British arrived there in 1763. Now, there were many slaves that did flee to Havana, Cuba, while others hid in the settlements in the wilderness of Florida when this happened. In 1816, Andrew Jackson led troops into Florida, and troops captured runaway slaves and sold them back into slavery, in many cases, whether they were free or not. Once Florida was transferred to the U.S. in 1821, free African Americans were finally granted freedom. However, the Seminole Wars broke out, and fighting took place between Seminole Native Americans and U.S. soldiers. And African Americans typically fought against U.S. troops on the side of the Indians in that war. There's a depiction of the Seminole Wars there. So, free African Americans in the North. Slaves who lived in the South viewed the North as a land of freedom. Now, free African Americans in the North did have some rights, including voting, serving on juries, and more careers, and they also had more freedom to move around than slaves in the South did. However, African Americans in the North still faced discrimination and segregation. Eventually, we will see these rights gradually be removed from African Americans in the North, and few whites will begin to actually consider African Americans as equals. Now, many states, including Pennsylvania, banned African Americans from voting, which, like I said, including Pennsylvania in 1838. Other states, though, especially New England, never removed voting rights for African Americans. So, expansion westward. In 1803, the United States purchased land from France that doubled the size of the country, and President Thomas Jefferson sent an expedition by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. You can see their pictures up here. That's with Sacagawea, their Indian guide, to explore the new territory. Now, a black slave named York also joined them and was an excellent hunter, fisherman, and helped with translating along Sacagawea. So that's African American York there, who helped along the Lewis and Clark expedition, but he still had to wait for his freedom for another 10 years. So, other influence in the West. African Americans also played influential roles in the West. Establishing paths in the Sierra Nevadas, James Beckwourth became a chief of the Crow people, excuse me, and one of the founders of Oregon was George Washington Bush, over here, and 26 of the original 46 settlers in Los Angeles were African American, and one was elected mayor in the 1790s. Alright, our closure. What success and struggles did free African Americans face? Think about some of the challenges they were dealing with. Think about some of the success they were having as well, whether it be voting rights or businesses or moving westward and things like that. And that will help you answer your question. I hope you have a great rest of your day or night. Let me know of any questions or concerns, and I'll talk to you all soon.